Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're putting the catastrophic collapse of the Third Reich's war machine under the microscope. As objective military historians, we really have to ask, how did a force that so quickly conquered Europe end up utterly annihilated in just a few short years? Well, the answer isn't found in a single battle, but rather in a fascinating, fatal chain of logistical and strategic failures.
Here is the roadmap for our explainer today. We'll start with the limits of Blitzkrieg, then move to the logistical collapse in the East, tactical rigidity at Stalingrad, the shift to an industrial war of attrition, paranoia versus Allied strategy, and finally the ultimate strategic catastrophe.
Let's dive right into part 1. The limits of Blitzkrieg and what happens when incredible speed meets unforgiving geography.
You're probably familiar with the doctrine of Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. It was absolutely devastating in confined, highly developed environments. In just over a month, it brought about the fall of France, using fast-moving tanks and Stuka bombers operating almost like a single, coordinated metallic creature. But this doctrine had a massive, hidden flaw. It fundamentally relied on incredibly short, secure supply lines and lightning-fast victories to actually work.
Tracing the early timeline, after tearing through Poland and France, the German military hit a literal wall in 1940 during the Battle of Britain. Their inability to break the Royal Air Force was a huge strategic catalyst. It meant Germany couldn't secure the West, which basically guaranteed the one nightmare scenario their military doctrine feared most, an unwinnable two-front war.
Which brings us to part 2, logistical collapse in the East and the utter supply failure of Operation Barbarossa.
When that famous speed failed, a cascading logistical nightmare kicked in. The German military planned for a quick, 3-month campaign, but the sheer vastness of the Soviet Union stopped Blitzkrieg dead in its tracks. First, supply lines stretched until they practically snapped. Then came the Rasputitsa, that infamous autumn mud that literally swallowed mechanized forces and forced them back to using horses just to move artillery. And then, temperatures nosedived to 30 degrees below zero. We're talking engines, weapons, and supply lines freezing solid.
This is where we start seeing a fatal divergence in command. Professional military generals were practically begging for strategic retreats to reorganize and build solid defensive lines. But Hitler's ideological mandates completely overrode sound military doctrine. He issued rigid, not one-step-back orders, somehow believing sheer political willpower could beat logistics and winter weather. This political irrationality directly set the stage for an unprecedented disaster.
That takes us to part 3, tactical rigidity at Stalingrad and the death of the Sixth Army.
The German Sixth Army found itself caught in an absolute labyrinth of urban rubble, where tanks were useless and the Luftwaffe couldn't even drop bombs without hitting their own troops. So we really have to ask, how exactly did a rigid no-retreat mandate turn this into such a historically avoidable disaster?
The answer boils down to Hitler's absolute mandate. He declared, "The German soldier does not retreat, he stays and fights." When the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, attacking the vulnerable flanks of the German lines, the Sixth Army was instantly surrounded. General Paulus desperately requested authorization to break out, but that no-retreat order completely stripped commanders of any operational flexibility. It literally trapped 300,000 men in a poppet of ice and fire.
Just 90,000. Out of the 300,000 men trapped in that pocket, barely 90,000 survived to surrender in February 1943. This wasn't just a heavy loss. The entire myth of German invincibility was permanently shattered by an entirely avoidable catastrophe. From that day on, the Reich essentially stopped advancing.
Moving on to part 4, the industrial war of attrition, factories versus battlefields.
By this point, Blitzkrieg was definitively dead. What took its place was an industrial war of attrition. The conflict shifted into a brutal economic competition over fuel, steel, and bread. Resources the Third Reich simply didn't have the capacity to sustain against a massive global coalition.
The sheer scale of the Allied material advantage was absolutely overwhelming. While Germany was suffocating from crippling oil shortages and bombed-out infrastructure, the Allies were adapting brilliantly. The Soviets pulled off a massive logistical miracle, relocating over 1,500 factories way beyond the Ural Mountains to keep production safe. At the same time, the American Lend-Lease program poured incredible resources into the East. We're talking 400,000 trucks and 14,000 aircraft. It proved this war was now being decided on assembly lines.
This industrial reality climaxed at Kursk in 1943, the largest tank battle in history. Germany rolled in with 3,000 panzers, but they were simply crushed by 5,000 Soviet tanks. And it wasn't just raw numbers. German tactical rigidity completely failed against massive Soviet defensive depth, endless layers of trenches and minefields. Germany lost hundreds of tanks they simply couldn't replace, permanently ending their offensive capabilities on the Eastern Front.
Now for Part 5, Paranoia versus Allied Strategy and the Collapse of Command.
You know, it wasn't just physical resources failing them. The invisible war of information and coordination was heavily shifting against them too. We need to explore how the hunters became the hunted, thanks to critical intelligence failures and broken codes. Behind the scenes, Allied intelligence was systematically dismantling German strategy piece by piece. The brilliant minds at Bletchley Park cracked the Enigma code, which allowed the British to reroute convoys and actively hunt submarines. They destroyed 250 U-boats in just 6 months of 1943. Meanwhile, Soviet intelligence had perfectly intercepted the plans for Kursk, turning a supposed German surprise attack into a heavily anticipated slaughter. The contrast in leadership styles here is absolutely wild. On one side, you have a seamlessly coordinated Allied front moving with industrial precision, combining American resources, British air and naval control, and Soviet land endurance. On the flip side, a totally paranoid German high command where Hitler was actively dismissing his most experienced generals, refusing to allow industrial withdrawals despite relentless bombings, and where blind loyalty completely replaced actual tactical competence.
Which brings us to our final section, Part 6, the final strategic catastrophe.
Tracing this timeline to the bitter end, you can really see the strategic noose tightening. After losing their offensive power at Kursk, the hugely successful Allied D-Day invasion in 1944, Operation Overlord, finally forced Germany into the exact scenario professional military doctrine warned against, a completely unwinnable multi-front war that would ultimately end in the ruins of Berlin in 1945.
Looking at the big picture, it's clear this downfall wasn't some sudden, unexplainable event. It was the direct result of 3 structural pillars completely giving way under the weight of terrible decision-making. Strategically, they locked themselves into a premature and unmanageable two-front war. Economically, their crippling logistical scarcity just couldn't compete against overwhelming Allied industrial might. And fundamentally, on a human level, ideological fanaticism completely ignored professional military advice, virtually guaranteeing their own operational destruction.
So, we'll wrap up this explainer with a pretty profound question. It forces us to consider a timeless lesson. Can any military machine, no matter how powerful or technologically advanced, actually survive when political irrationality and unchecked ego fully override professional military doctrine? Something to think about as we sign off.